So one of the biggest hurdles of building a clean, small form factor gaming PC is that the case itself often takes up a big chunk of that price. And as time has gone on, I can't help but feel that that problem is just getting worse. We've got the Ncase M1, which we've looked at extensively on this channel, and retails for a solid $180. And then there's the Dancase A4, which released last year, an incredibly optimized enclosure, which accommodates a full-length graphics card at just 7 liters of volume, but at an absurd price of $350 at the time of filming. At prices like this, you'd wonder why anyone would want to build a small form factor gaming system in the first place. However, there are a few budget-friendly options out there, and today I'm bringing the spotlight to one of them that feels extremely familiar to the case that I use as my daily driver, but actually released back in 2015. So for just $50 you can get your hands on the Cougar QBX, a 19.9 liter ITX enclosure which offers a ton of value for the money and looks great while doing so as well. The main difference between these two cases besides the price is that the Cougar QBX, despite looking very similar in size to the Ncase M1, is actually over 50% larger in volume, as it is longer, wider and taller than the M1, although I do think that we'd all agree that the two cases look a lot closer in size than what those numbers would suggest. Still though, the QBX just sneaks its way into the small form factor PC status, as it is under 20 liters of volume. In terms of design, I'm really liking the overall aesthetics and stance of this case, with the side panels extruding outwards for better airflow and cable management, and I do appreciate the discreet approach to case feet as well. The angles are consistent throughout, and the color choice of space gray is one of my personal favorites and really resembles premium hardware. You'd be mistaken though for thinking that these are aluminum panels, as they do have that brushed texture, but surprisingly they are just plastic, and of course they don't actually feel premium at all, since they barely weigh a thing and are a little bit flimsy as well. Many would argue though that once you've actually built inside the case, it doesn't really matter. The PCB for the front I/O is absolutely atrocious and really does expose that this case is a couple years old now, but don't worry because once you've actually built your system, that circuit board is pretty much hidden. Speaking of the front I/O, we've got your standard mic and headphone jack and power button, and for USB we've got two USB 3.0 ports. The positioning on the right side might not be appealing for some, but I actually prefer it compared to the I/O on the Ncase M1, which is in your face 100% of the time. At least this way it will be positioned away from you. Branding is kept to a minimum, which is always appreciated. Just some subtle Cougar branding at the front, and even if this is a little too much for you, you can always remove it, seeing as it is just a sticker. There is slim optical disc drive support at the front, but in general I would have preferred if this space was allocated to 2.5 inch or 3.5 inch drive space, as it feels kind of empty to the Ncase M1, which can fit multiple drives at the front, or the option for a full optical disc drive. We're getting a mesh cutout for the majority of both side panels to allow the case to breathe a little. No dust filters, although there is one at the bottom which does slide in and out nicely. And sliding off the side panels, we can now reveal the interior layout. And for those who have done their homework on the Ncase M1, this layout will feel extremment familiar. Of course though, it is a bit roomier inside since we are getting that 50% increase in volume. You can fit an ATX power supply up to 140mm in length here, just like you can with the Ncase M1, and this provides some pretty good budget options, seeing as a 500 watt ATX power supply is pretty inexpensive compared to the much smaller SFX power supplies, which actually aren't supported anyway with the QBX. Also note that the manual clearly advises not to use a power supply with a certain socket orientation, but I did manage to get this to fit quite easily by plugging it into the unit before installation. Do note though that you won't be able to use a slim optical disc drive at the same time, as the power supply cable does block it. Now, in terms of drive support, a 3.5 inch drive does make quite a bit of sense here, especially in this budget price category. And we have the side panel cage which can accommodate that, along with two 2.5 inch drives as well. My favorite spot for a 2.5 inch drive is on the flip side of the motherboard though, in this neat little area here where an SSD will fit perfectly. And I wish they would have allowed room for another 2.5 inch drive to fit here as well, seeing as it is the perfect location in my opinion, and there is a little bit of extra room here on the left. The side cage does swivel at the top as well, which should make connecting everything a whole lot easier. And here we have some solid cooling options as well, with support for up to a 240mm radiator with a single 120mm fan on the motherboard side. But if you prefer air cooling, the QBX can accommodate a cooler height of up to 135mm, as long as you don't have a fan installed on the side cage. The official spec sheet states a maximum cooler height of 105mm, but this Cryorig M9i with a height of 125mm was no problem at all. For the graphics card, we have support for up to 350mm in length and roughly 135mm in height. So the only cards that aren't compatible here are 3-slot cards or those with a PCB height of over 135mm, like some of the MSI Gaming X cards. Something like a 2.5-slot 1080 Ti will fit fine though, you'll just have limited fan support underneath. 2 slim 120mm fans will fit fine though. Cable management was what impressed me quite a bit in this little enclosure, and despite its relatively small size, there are quite a lot of cable routing cutouts with mindful positioning, and I was able to achieve some fairly decent cable management overall, so even if you're not using a modular power supply with custom cables or anything like that, you shouldn't worry at all because you can make it look pretty tidy quite easily. And lastly, for fan support, in addition to the included 90mm fan at the rear and the tiny 80mm fan slot that you can accommodate at the front, you can fit up to 5 120mm fans here, which is pretty insane. 2 at the bottom, 1 on the side cage, and another 2 on the top. And now let's talk about the system temperatures and what I would recommend in terms of fan positioning. So the system here is a delitted 7700K overclocked to 4.9 GHz at 1.25 volts, the Cryorig M9i CPU cooler, and a GTX 1070 Founders Edition. And for optimal fan positioning, I found that with my particular setup that running both bottom and top fans as intake fans was the best approach, and we're getting some really solid temperatures here. At idle, we're not seeing much difference at all compared to the Ncase M1, although the CPU temps on the QBX are a little bit cooler here, but once we bump it up to full CPU load, the QBX does take the lead, and this does make sense since we are getting an extra 2 fans positioned right next to the heatsink, providing some extra cooling. GPU temps are pretty similar between the two cases, although I think the bottom intake fans on the Ncase M1 may be a little bit more effective since they have a little bit more room to breathe compared to the Cougar QBX. Also, if you want to talk about optimizing acoustic performance, if you're running a similar setup to me, then I'd recommend getting rid of this bottom intake fan that is blowing directly onto the graphics card shroud, and also the top intake fan that is blowing directly onto the power supply. I found that by removing these 2 fans, I didn't notice much difference at all in terms of performance, but you will have a quieter system at the end of the day. And so for $50 you'd be hard pressed to find anything that competes with the Cougar QBX in terms of compatibility, airflow, and volume. Although it lacks aluminum side panels like a lot of the expensive small form factor cases out there, I'm really impressed with how much it offers and just how close it really comes to something like the Ncase M1, which costs almost 4 times as much. As always guys, I want to hear what you guys think of the QBX. It'll be 3 years old in 2018, but I think it's even more relevant today than ever when small form factor enclosures are just getting pricier and pricier. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, and as always, I will see you all in the next one.